Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and today I thought I would take a little time to talk about a really common question I've gotten on Instagram. I didn't ask me anything last week, and one of the most popular questions I got was about encouraging good sibling behavior amongst each other and limiting, I guess, sibling fights, and how do I go about doing that. So I guess today I thought I would talk about that. So I want to preface this discussion by saying I don't want to pretend to be an expert at all. I'm just a mom of 7 children. My oldest is 13 and my youngest is 9 months. So obviously I have yet to navigate those teenage years where you have, 4 or 5 teenagers in the house and they might be fighting. That's a whole different ballgame. What I kind of wanted to talk about was with younger children and I guess setting a good foundation for how they're going to handle their sibling relationships and what seems to work with us. And so if that's something that interests you, why don't you stick around and we'll talk about it. So something I always say that's important to think about when you're discussing sibling relationships is that it's going to be very different. The dynamics of your family are going to be very different depending on where your children are schooled. So for example, my children are homeschooled. I have 7 children and they have never been schooled outside of the home. And so they don't know what it's like to have their peers be, I guess, same sex, same age children that aren't a part of their family. So the way they experience their sibling relationships are going to be very different than the way a child who goes to school outside of the home and spends the majority of his time in relationships with people that aren't their family members. The way they handle sibling dynamics might be a little different. So that is something to, I guess, to consider when you're listening to my advice here. I feel like it might be a little easier for homeschooled children to navigate those family dynamics, those sibling dynamics. You might think it would be harder since they're stuck at home with their siblings all the time and there really isn't much of a chance for escape. But I have found with my children that it actually has made it easier. I don't deal with a lot of the issues that other families deal with because my children are home together most of the time. Now, they do have relationships with other children who are friends who are not their family members, but the amount of time they spend fostering those relationships is much less than the time that they have here at home. Many weeks might go by where the only other children that my children see are their family members, their siblings. And so, of course, by necessity, it's important for them to have good sibling relationships because there really isn't another option. When, if you're constantly fighting with your siblings and they're the only other children that you have to play with, then obviously that isn't a very smart thing to do. So I feel like by nature, my children try to work on their relationships with their siblings and try to get along really well because they don't want to be left alone with no other children to play with. And if you're the brother or your sister that's constantly picking on all the other children, they're not going to want to play with you and you're going to be lonely. So I guess that is an important distinction to make. So since I'm talking about my homeschooled children, and that's very different from children who are schooled outside of their home, I also want to say that there's a huge difference, at least in our family, between the cultural perception of siblings and the perception that we have of siblings here in our home. I found that a lot of the books that I read as a child, the movies I watched, the TV shows I watched, even way back then in the 1980s, little siblings were viewed as an annoyance and a nuisance by most of the characters in those books and those movies. It was very rare that you found something in the media that portrayed a family as getting together and as a cohesive unit. And so I guess it created a culture where it was just the norm to view your little siblings as kind of bratty or kind of annoying and in the way. And whatever media you're watching, that is I guess you're gonna in turn treat your little siblings that way. So our first kind of rule in fostering good relationships is to not allow those influences in here. If I find that we're watching a children's movie where the people are treating brothers and sisters that way, we'll stop it and we'll actually comment on, can you believe how they're treating their little brothers and their sisters? That's not very nice, because we want to make a point to not normalize that behavior. I want our children to realize that that isn't the norm. Treating your brothers and sisters that way, shouldn't be acceptable. And I guess it's going to be easier to emphasize that to your children if all of the books and the movies they're reading aren't, I guess, creating that cultural myth that all little siblings are bothersome. So I guess that's our first practical tip, would be to not allow those influences into your home. Okay, so if that isn't the culture that you want to have in your home, then you need to create a different culture. So in our home, we talk about what a blessing little siblings are. And my children, even though there are 7 of them, I have a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old boy that view their little siblings as such a blessing that they're begging me already, even though they have a 9-month-old little brother, they want more. They say, when can we have more babies? Because we've created a family culture where they view children as blessings. And let me show you kind of how we've done that. Sorry, I'm watching a baby as I do this, trying to keep him from falling off the couch over here by me. So if I look back to my own childhood, and my peers, my friends were my main sphere of influence. And the reason why I chose the friends that I did and had the connection with the friends that I did have was because we shared common goals and interests. I was involved in certain activities and sports that created a teamwork atmosphere, and so my teammates were my closest friends because we felt like we were all working towards the same goals. And when you're working together to achieve a goal with somebody, you're by nature going to have to make that relationship work. You're going to be on good terms, because obviously you can't achieve a goal together if you're constantly bickering. And so that same kind of philosophy transfers over into the family unit. You need to view your family as a team, and you need to stress that amongst your children. So I guess the question becomes then, how do you create a teamwork atmosphere in a family? And for us, we're a Christian family, so our framework, our frame of reference is that our entire family's goal together is to bring glory and honor to the Lord in the ways that we interact with each other and in all the work we do. And so we're going to stress that whenever the children are not acting kind to one another, that is our frame of reference. That's where we're going to begin our correction with. But also, on a more practical level for children to understand, for us, we are a homesteading family. We have a homestead here that we're running, and that is our goal, is to keep the homestead functioning. You know, there are animals we need to care for. There's work that we need to get done. And we have created an environment here where everybody is necessary, even down to the little ones, to achieve that goal. And so we rely on all of them, and the siblings rely on one another to get the work done. Some of their chores are shared work that they have to do together. And I think finding opportunities in your life to get the children to work together is going to help strengthen their relationship and their bond, because it's a lot harder to work alongside somebody that that you're not getting along with and that you're constantly bickering with. But if you're forced to find a way to make it work so that you achieve the goal of getting your chores done, I feel like it just strengthens that relationship. So having a common goal, creating that teamwork environment in your family is no different than having a teamwork environment on a sports team or in a club or an activity that your children would have with their friends, their peers outside of the home. And so obviously not everybody is going to live on a homestead and have that opportunity, but just in the management of your home, you can divide out chores and have children work together on some of those chores. And the more they work together, I feel like the more that is practice in strengthening their relationship and figuring out a way to make it work. And if you start them young, obviously that's going to be a whole lot easier than taking 2 children whose relationship is already strained and throwing them together and having them figure out how to work together on a chore. You know, there's going to be some growing pains in the beginning of that. But in the end, if you stick through it, I feel like their relationship will get stronger. You know, and along those lines of creating a family culture that is fostering sibling relationships, there have been times where my children aren't perfect, and I don't want to pretend for them to be. I will say that I feel like my children have really good relationships with one another, and their bickering and their quarreling is very seldom happens. But there are some children that it tends to happen more with. I find my oldest son and my oldest daughter tend to have 2 personalities that conflict much more than anyone else in the household. And I recognize that a lot of that has to do with just the differences in their genders. My daughter is very sensitive emotionally in a way that my son isn't. My boys interact with each other in ways that maybe it isn't as easy to interact with girls in that way. My boys tease each other a lot and are very rough, and they can handle that. And they actually, oh honey, they actually enjoy that behavior. They enjoy teasing one another. And so sometimes my oldest son might try to push the limits of how he can interact in that way with my daughter, and she can't quite handle that level of teasing or physical roughness. Oh! And so there have been moments where their relationship has been strained because of those differences in behavior and gender. Sorry, I was interrupted. So as I was saying, the differences in gender have made a big difference. And so approaching that with my children as how they are a team once again. And so I had to sit my oldest son down at one point when I noticed that he was constantly picking on my daughter and she was not enjoying that, and it was really straining their relationship. And day after day I was finding that they were fighting more and more. I sat him down one day and I reminded him that, you know, he is the oldest son in this house, and he is one of the few male influences that my daughter has on a daily basis in her life here at home. And so I reminded him that the influences that we have as children are going to affect the way we view other people as we grow up. And so I told him, you know, for example, as a girl, the way the men in her life or the boys in her life treat her as a child, that will become normalized to her. And as she grows up, she's going to expect that all the men in her life will treat her that way. And so obviously I reminded him that, you know, he has a father that is very good to the women in his life and treats them very well. But it's just as important that a girl has brothers in her life that treat her that way. And I asked him, you know, if any other boys out there in the world treated Gracie the way that he was treating her, how would he feel? And he said, well, obviously that's not okay. I wouldn't be okay with that. And I said, so it's no different for you. And if you keep treating her that way, she's going to think it's okay for boys to be rough with her or to tease her that way and hurt her feelings, you know, or make her feel bad or whatever. And she might even seek out, you know, people that treat her that way. And, you know, you want her to have healthy relationships with males one day. So you in turn need to do your part in helping to create that. And I said, and the same goes for her. You know, the way that, you know, the relationship that you have with her is going to color the relationship you have with other females. If you're, you know, and anyways, so my kids are old enough now as they're entering the teenage years for us to have those conversations where they can kind of understand that. And so whenever the bickering between those two specifically starts to get to that point, I will remind him of that. And he's like, oh yeah. So they are a team, you know, the experiences that they're having here as children are going to color the way they relate to people for the rest of their life, and letting them know that, you know, you want to have healthy relationships for the sake of your siblings. And you know, it's a culture of we're all trying to help one another. We're all trying to bring glory to the Lord so that we can grow up, that we can be good people that can navigate good relationships outside of the home. And I guess that's been helpful for us a little bit here too. And children are no different than adults in terms of having good days and bad days. You know, I have days where I struggle with impatience with my children, just like my children are going to have days where they're impatient with one another. But I can recognize too that I have certain triggers as an adult, and I can see those same triggers in my children. So for example, if I have days where I've gotten very sucked into my phone and where my focus hasn't been on my family and on my children, but is instead on the things that I'm doing in my own little world on my phone, or I'm thinking about a situation that happened outside of the home, it's just kind of on my mind where I'm distracted, I guess. I'm going to interact with my children in a way where sometimes they feel like they're distracting. The children are distracting me, and I might act more impatient with them because they're pulling me away from what is on my mind. And I've noticed the same behavior in my children with each other. If my children are particularly into screens, we have gone through phases where maybe they got a new pad for a holiday gift or something like that, and they are just really into the screen, and we're allowing them during this holiday break to play on that screen. and then a sibling comes, and it's an interaction that normally wouldn't be any issue, but that day the child that's on the screen feels like they're being distracted. They might lash out in a way that they normally wouldn't, and then it triggers a fight, and then behavior starts to spiral. And I have definitely connected screen use with bad behavior amongst siblings. There's something about, you get so focused to what's happening on the screen that anyone pulling you away from that, I don't know, you get a little impatient. And so if you're noticing an increase of bad behavior amongst your siblings and of quarreling, I would take a look at how much screen time they're having, and maybe you need to do a little detox, because once again, you take the screens away, the kids have to get a little more creative with how they're going to entertain one another. And so they might then be forced to work together to entertain one another. They might decide to play a game together instead, or go outside and shoot the basketball together instead. And when they're working together toward a common goal, they're going to get along better than if they're doing individual activities where they feel like the siblings are just distracting from them. So, yeah, maybe look at that. See if there are any triggers in your children in particular, like mine seem to be with the screens. And I guess my final bit of advice is that children mimic what they see. A lot of bad behaviors are simply learned behaviors. And so either if they're not getting it from the TV and the movies that they're watching, they're probably getting it from you. And parenting, mothering has been one of the most humbling experiences, because there have been times in my life where I have recognized a way that my children are interacting with one another that is not kind and that is rather ugly. And it's very convicting to me, because I see that they learned that behavior from me. They saw me maybe yell really harshly one time when I was frustrated, and so then the next time they got frustrated, they thought it was okay to yell at one another that way. And I have to step back and realize, wow, I better change, my heart if I'm going to expect my children to be kind and patient to one another when they're really struggling. And then that's where your marriage comes into play too, because if your kids see two parents that are able to overcome disagreements in a positive way, or that don't disagree in unhealthy ways in front of them, it's going to be a lot easier for them to figure out those, how to handle disagreements with their own siblings. And so I guess it's my last bit of advice, and that's the hardest advice I think to put into practice, is that generally when we start seeing these problems in our kids, it's a symptom that maybe we're modeling inappropriate behavior to them, and we need to really change our own hearts. And that's the hard work. That's why they say mothering is sanctifying work, because while we're trying to shepherd our children into acting better, we're in turn really, shepherding ourselves or trying to work on ourselves. And so as I mentioned, I don't want to pretend to be an expert here. I have no idea what's going to happen in the teenage years as hormones come into play, and as we're navigating, we're going to have 4 teenagers in the house at once, and what that's going to be like. But my hope, my prayer is that we've set the foundation when they were young and created a strong family culture, a strong bond to where the children wouldn't be tempted to act that way, or would realize it isn't normal to act that way with each other, even if the culture says that it is. And so, yeah. Anyways, I hope that maybe there's something that you can glean from this rambling I did, but I had a few people ask me for my thoughts and thought I would just put it out there while all the other children were playing outside and I'm just in here with Benji. And so, yeah, I hope this video finds you blessed, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.